everyone, and welcome to the opening video lecture for week 7. This week we're continuing our analysis of modernity and dehumanization, but we're focusing on a recurring trope in modern genocides, i.e. the blood metaphor. Why is it that perpetrators are so fixated on the purity/contamination of quote-unquote blood? Reading 1 this week is by anthropologist Uli Linke, whose work centers on the cultural politics of nationhood in Europe, with particular attention to the political anthropology of the body, racial formations, regimes of exclusion, and violence and genocide. Next is another anthropologist, Christopher Taylor, who did extensive field work in Rwanda and actually had to flee the country along with his Tutsi wife just as the 1994 genocide began. Once safely back in the US, he began studying the country's political cartoons and the role of local symbolism in the genocidal process. Finally, we have Australian historian Catherine Ellinghaus, who specializes in the gendered dimensions of settler colonialism and the role of blood discourse in the management of miscegenation, or quote-unquote interracial sexual relations and offspring. Reading 1 begins with the introduction of Uli Linke's book, Blood and Nation, The European Aesthetics of Race. So what does she mean by the aesthetics of race? Aesthetics in this sense really isn't about beauty and art per se, but about how things are perceived and made visible. This is crucially important in the case of race, which, as we've seen, is a social construct. It's not real in any objective, biological sense. Rather, it's artificial, man-made. So how do we see something that is inherently imaginary? This is where the role of symbolism and discursive violence is so crucial. By discursive violence, I refer to the discourse, or structures of knowledge that legitimize actual physical violence. We see this very much played out in the role of Nazi ideology and propaganda. Reading 1 then jumps ahead to chapter 6, where the author covers the Nazi era, when the idiom of blood and soil, or Blut und Boden, was dominant. Blood and soil was a German expression that gained currency in the Völkisch movement of the late 19th century, and eventually became a key slogan of Nazi ideology. You see here an image of Richard Walter Darré, a Nazi ideologue who I cited earlier as an exemplar of the gardening metaphor. Anyways, this brand of ideology idealized the role of the peasantry, carried a strong anti-urban bias, hence the fixation on soil. As far as the blood metaphor was concerned, it was rooted in the idealization of ancestral bloodlines of the supposedly pure Aryan race, as well as a concomitant fear of contaminating elements. Indeed, Nazi propaganda was very effective in recycling medieval-era legends about Jews, especially the so-called blood libel, which accused Jews of kidnapping and murdering the children of Christians in order to use their blood as part of religious rituals. Indeed, this legend also tapped into an existential anxiety of Nazi anti-Semitism, which was that the Jews threatened to defile and contaminate the supposedly pure Aryan bloodline. Indeed, I've touched upon this sense of an existential threat as a motivating factor before, and it's something that we'll come back to next week as well. Anyways, Nazi propaganda was rife with symbolic meaning, but as we've seen, there's a difference between symbolic violence and actual physical violence. In the case of Nazi propaganda, however, such metaphors were meant to be taken literally, not metaphorically. Indeed, Nazi policy revolved around metaphors of blood and soil. Thus, we see how such metaphors dominated the Nazi era. Okay, so reading 2 doesn't focus on blood per se, but it does concern the symbolism of bodily fluids during the Rwandan genocide. Really quick, I should issue a trigger warning. This reading does contain graphic imagery. On page 167 of the in-text page numbers, or page 41 of the PDF, there's a really violent and sexually explicit cartoon. Please skip over this if you feel it might make you uncomfortable. Anyways, the premise of this reading is that there are cultural meanings behind the physical techniques of cruelty. Violence and torture often follow specific cultural modalities. In Rwanda, local cultural ontologies place great importance on the role of bodily fluids as a metaphor for the body politic. Generally speaking, pathological states are characterized by obstructions or excessive flows. Much of the violence during the genocide followed this cultural patterning, as individual Rwandans lashed out against a perceived internal other who threatened, in their imaginary, both their personal integrity and the cosmic order of the state. It was overwhelmingly Tutsi who were the sacrificial victims in what, in many respects, was a massive ritual of purification, a ritual intended to purge the nation of obstructing beings, as the threat of obstruction was imagined through a Rwandan ontology that situates the body politic in an analogical relation to the individual human body. Indeed, in Rwanda of 1994, torturers manifested a certain proclivity to employ violent methods with specific forms. These forms betrayed a preoccupation with the movement of persons and substances, and with the canals, arteries, and conduits along which persons and substances flow, rivers, roadways, pathways, even the conduits of the human body, such as reproductive and digestive systems. So, for example, the mass dumping of bodies in Rwanda's rivers performed the symbolic act of purification, as this quote-unquote human waste was metaphorically flushed out of the body politic. Indeed, as we'll see in greater detail next week, when we look at the Hamitic hypothesis that said that the Tutsi were foreign colonizers and that the Hutu were indigenous, the flushing of such quote-unquote human waste sent these foreigners back to where they supposedly came from, thereby excreting this hated foreign other. The author also talks about the symbolism of roadblocks, which, strategically speaking, were totally counterproductive as far as the Civil War was concerned, but in terms of the genocide, were one of the primary techniques or sites of group destruction. As victims were obstructed along these roadblocks, they were often physically mutilated, with limbs hacked off and their Achilles heels sliced open, as a way of immobilizing the victims so that they could be finished off later on in the process. But this technique of cruelty has a certain logic to it, where human beings are concerned. In the presence of such a large number of potential victims, too many to kill at once, the Hutu death squad might immobilize fleeing victims so that they could return at their leisure and complete their work. So this has been an important theme of the class, at least since week 4, thinking about the cultural modalities of violence, or the symbolic effects or meanings that certain genocidal techniques take on. So, like I said, even though blood isn't really the primary metaphor here, the image of the body politic is still very much operational. So in that sense, I want you to think about how metaphors and symbols play an important role. Reading 3 comes back more explicitly to the role of blood, but it takes a much different approach. So, whereas the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide were explicitly concerned with the violent expulsion of others, cases of settler colonialism that are examined here in Reading 3, in particular the United States and Australia, there is a much different strategy. Elimination was to be achieved not through the violent expulsion of others, but rather through their forced assimilation. Blood, in this sense, was not seen as a medium of contamination, but as a mode of dilution. This was especially apparent in the so-called blood quantum system that was, and still is, used in the administration of indigenous peoples in the United States. Now, although this particular system wasn't used in Australia, the logic there was very much the same, the idea being that indigenous peoples could be bred out of existence. Anyways, the so-called blood quantum rule is used to legally define who is, and more crucially, who is not, an Indian. This rule is supposed to measure the degree of Indian ancestry, and it's often used today to define tribal enrollment status, or membership. As explained by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency within the U.S. Department of Interior, one's degree of Indian blood is computed from lineal ancestors of Indian blood who were enrolled with a federally recognized Indian tribe or whose names appear on the designated base rolls of a federally recognized Indian tribe. So the basic idea of this concept is that it's supposed to be a measurement of miscegenation, or the mixture of so-called races. The blood quantum is a fractionalizing measurement, a calculation of quote-unquote distance in relation to some supposed purity to mark one's generational proximity to a full-blooded forebear. So, for example, a full-blooded Indian would be a whole integer, 1, 4/4. Someone who's a so-called half-breed would be 1/2 Indian. Or if someone just had a single grandparent, they would be 1/4. Going down the line, someone could be 1/8, 1/16, 1/32, 1/32, 1/64, and so on. This fractionalizing measurement, this racial arithmetic, has an inherently eliminatory logic. Indeed, if you multiply fractions over and over, you get a smaller and smaller number. So the author of Reading 3 quotes an American historian on page 62, Patricia Limerick, who captures the inherently genocidal implications of this rule. So let's say you set the blood quantum rule at 1/4, hold to it as a rigid definition of Indians, let intermarriage proceed, as it had for centuries, and eventually Indians will be defined out of existence. When that happens, the federal government will be freed of its persistent quote-unquote Indian problem. So again, I want you to consider how the idea of blood operates as a metaphor. Really, I don't want to get caught up in the question of whether or not this was genocide or some alternative concept like ethnocide, although we can certainly discuss such a possible conceptual distinction on the discussion forum. My point is that the question of whether or not this was a genocide is not the point. Rather, our point here is how, again, blood operates as a metaphor. And what's interesting is how, in this circumstance, the metaphor is so different from what we saw in other cases. At the same time, however, looking ahead to reading 4, which we'll cover in Lesson 7b, the blood quantum rule evokes some eerie similarities to the so-called Mischlinge, or the mixed-race Jews that bedeviled the Nazi regime. And really, there's no logical inconsistency here. Remember, race is imaginary, it's not real, so the rules can vary and change according to different circumstances. Okay, so that's pretty much it for 7a. I'll forego my usual spiel and save my comments for the next steps for Lesson 7b. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.